This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for your attendance. Great to see such a big crowd here. I know how interesting and important this topic is. My name is Alex White, Director General of the Institute of International European Affairs. As I say, it's my pleasure to welcome everybody. I have no more work to do other than that, and to say how great it has been working with Vodafone, Sabrina Casalta, Chief Executive, and her team. It's been great to work with you on this important event. And my sole job now is to introduce the chair and moderator of this event, who's my good colleague, board member of the Institute, former Secretary General of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, Dr. Orla Quill.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all so much for being here. As Alex said, we're delighted that the IIEA and Vodafone have collaborated on this event. I think it's a topic that's of huge interest to us all. And I think the fact that there are so many in the room and we had such a heavy waiting list shows that very clearly to us. So today's event is securing Ireland's competitiveness through digital infrastructure. A couple of housekeeping rules, if I may, just before we start. 2 exits down here if we run into an emergency. Please note that today's session will be recorded. It's not Chatham House rule, so again, will be recorded and will be made available afterwards. We have a great panel, and I will introduce them following the Minister, because we're absolutely delighted to have Minister Patrick O'Donovan here with us today. As you know, the Minister is Minister for Culture, Communications and Sport, and it is great that he has been able to carve out some time for us. He's a former Minister for Further and Higher Education, so again, that skills piece is obviously another area that's directly applicable in this area. So, also please note that we don't have any flash photography in the room here, and no flash lighting is permitted, so please be sensitive to that and keep that in mind. I'll briefly introduce our panel and then I'll ask the Minister to come up and address us. So first, beside me on the right here is Joakim Reiter. Joakim is Chief External and Corporate Affairs Officer at Vodafone Group. Delighted to have you. Joakim has a lot of experience in this area and also has huge experience in the international and foreign affairs area dealing with these topics in Sweden. Next to Joakim, we have Gareth Blaney, who's the Chair and Commissioner of the Commission for Communications and Regulation. Gareth, again, brings huge private sector experience to this area, and we will hear from him. And then Frances Ruane, again, many of you will know, she's the Chair of the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council and a very distinguished person of many boards and former Director of the Economic and Social Research Institute. So, without any further ado, I might ask the Minister to step up and join us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Orla, and thanks very much, everybody, for the very nice welcome. As I about to break the microphone. So, gur míle mágah agus fáilte romh go léir an seo ócáid speisialta seo agus ócáil an a hábhachtach seo an dispóg seo. Securing Ireland's competitiveness is in bold, and the byline is through digital infrastructure. Because, as Orla quite rightly said, you could stick in a multiplicity of things after the fact. There, my previous department in DeFerris, taxation, our place in the world, transport, energy, you name it, and we could stick it in there. And of course, this is a time, I think, where it's only right that we are talking about competitiveness, particularly in the run-up into the budget, which is a kind of an economic cycle, comes around every year. And in that vein, I just want to acknowledge my predecessor in the department, Alex White, who's a former Minister for Communications, who's hosting through the IIEA today's event with Vodafone, and thank them both for it. And I suppose, look, from my perspective, just a few thoughts. This is a new department for us. The Department of Culture, Communications and Sport is a new department. And it saw off the department of the section of tourism and the Gaeltacht went to rural affairs and to enterprise, with communications coming in. And with it coming in has brought it in a totally different, I suppose, emphasis in terms of the department's roles and responsibilities. We now have responsibility for the regulatory and legislative framework for Ireland's telecoms into and off of the island. But as well as that, and I'm just after leaving them, we have a number of different regulatory authorities, including Commission of Man, with the media and social media element as well. So when the department was established, it was originally the Department of Arts, Culture, Communications, Media and Sport. And I know it's not Chatham House rules now, but civil servants are always great to come up with acronyms. And the acronym for that was SMAC. So I didn't fancy being the Minister for SMAC. So that's why we landed on the Department of Culture, which takes Arts and Culture, Communications, which takes media and communications, and all the telecoms and sport is an obvious one. So over the next while, in our role in the department, what we want to make sure is recognise the role the telecoms and the digital infrastructure has played and will play and does play in terms of making sure that Ireland has the economy and the economic successes that we have enjoyed up to now, but not taking anything for granted. And if you look around the world at the moment in terms of geopolitics and what's happening in the world at the moment, anybody that takes anything for granted at the moment is on a hiding to nowhere. And we know that even though, notwithstanding the fact that we're, members of the European Union, very successful members of the European Union, quite a wealthy country, we have a road to travel in terms of the rollout and development of our infrastructure. I was listening this morning, Morning Ireland, many of you were too, in relation to the very basic infrastructure that we all need, which is the ability to be able to flush the toilet. And in Dublin, that is becoming far more of a challenge every day of the week as the population continues to grow. And that's only one element of infrastructure. We also need to be connected to a grid. We need a fit-for-purpose electricity infrastructure. We need a telecoms infrastructure that means that you don't drop mobile phone calls on a train or on a motorway. And we need, obviously, infrastructure through what we did in the National Broadband Plan to make sure that regardless of where you live in the country, that your connectivity to the outside world should be no less or no worse than what it is if you're in the centre of Dublin. And in that space, the government has to lead in terms of laying out a policy platform, but it also has to lead in terms of investment, which we are doing by way of the National Development Plan. And you'll hear an awful lot of, I suppose, criticism, some justified, some totally erroneous in relation to infrastructure projects that have been delivered by the government, this previous government and other governments that might have run over budget. But you very rarely hear anything attaching to, for instance, remarks around the National Broadband Plan. And for those of you who weren't down at the ploughing, the Rural Ireland's annual pilgrimage, it was really, I think, nice to see, and it was very satisfying to see when I called to National Broadband Ireland and our own department pavilion as well, the Department of Communications, to see the change that has been made in terms of the basic accessing of infrastructural development in rural parts of the country, thanks to the government's intervention, which has been led out by National Broadband Ireland, on time, way ahead of schedule, and making a massive difference to people. You won't hear much about it on Morning Ireland because it's on time, it's making a huge difference, and it's something really positive. If it was the opposite, of course, it'd be wall-to-wall coverage. But look, that is what the media do, and more power to them. But it is transformational, and Vodafone are a key partner in that. And they're a key partner in making sure that, regardless where you live in the country, that the retail element of the broadband and mobile telephone networks that are available are absolutely critical. And we take this as a given now, but when I came into the Dáil first in 2011, I see my colleague, Minister Timmy Dooley there. We were on the same Oireachtas committee back in 2011. I mean, we were talking at the time around 3G, and I remember saying to somebody from the department at the time, I don't want 3G at all, I just want G. We have come that far, but we still have a long way to go. And in that way of having a long way to go, we have some issues with regard to, for instance, NIMBYism. Everybody wants a mobile phone, but no one wants a mobile phone mast. Everybody wants electricity, but no one wants wind turbines. No one wants solar panels. No one wants an electricity grid. They think that the electricity is going to fall out of the sky and the mobile phone signal is going to fall with it. And realistically, that's not a sustainable position, to be quite honest about it. I do think that people have a right to object. I don't for 1 minute say that people don't have a right to object. And that we also need to look at people's concerns, but we also need to look at the greater good as well. And the greater good of the country has been well served over the last number of years with the rollout of infrastructure that was quite, in many cases, going back to Pat Rabbitt's time when he was Minister for Communications, quite controversial, but decisions were taken at the time that were the right decisions, because otherwise, if they hadn't been taken at the time, we would have been left in a very, very difficult situation with regard to having probably, a third world infrastructure with regard to the making of a very basic thing like a telephone call. But we're very fortunate here in Ireland that we have moved on substantially from that. And in that space, we have 15 of the 25 very large online platforms and search engines are based here in Ireland, and 5 of the 7 recognised gold gatekeepers and 8 leading providers of cutting-edge AI models are also based here. But there's a whole pile more that's going to have to be done. And again, in that space, we can't take anything for granted. And in my previous role as Minister for Further and Higher Education, when I was going to school, AI when you came from a rural part of the country, AI meant something totally different to what it means now. But a lot of universities at that time were saying that this has to be part of the government's next iteration around a national development plan, because if we find ourselves repeating the mistakes that we might have made with regard to other rollouts in the past, our competitiveness is going to dwindle. And that is something that I think we have to be very, very mindful of. And I know that my colleague Peter Burke is too. In the second half of next year, we're going to have the presidency of the European Council. And this will be an opportunity for Ireland to really lay out where it is that we believe that Europe's approach to this also needs to go. Because one thing having a national ambition, a national set of policies, it's a totally different thing influencing a European plan in this space. And in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to Copenhagen for an informal with my colleagues around the comms ministers. And obviously, look, a lot of the difficulties that we encountered here in Ireland is now going to be, par for the course in some of the more recent accession countries, and those countries that aren't members but hope to be member states as well, in the Balkans, in the Western Balkans. When they come into the European Union, the exact same difficulties are going to lie for them. So Ireland has not only a potential to be a leader, but it also has a potential to be a teacher in this space in terms of making sure that the improvements that are needed for ordinary basic infrastructural improvements in our telecoms and digital services, that they can not only be done here in Ireland, but that they can be done across the European Union. And the best example of that is, as I said a while ago, the National Broadband Plan. The National Broadband Plan got off to a fairly rocky start, to be quite honest about it. We don't remember it now, but there was an awful lot of detractors. People said it was an awful waste of money. I remember one particular senior civil servant saying that it was a particular waste of money, and why would you want to invest so much money in giving people down the country the right to be able to book flights on Ryanair or Aer Lingus? The reality is that shortly after the rollout of it came COVID, and everything changed. And all of a sudden, working from home has become the norm, and people based in Dublin can live quite happily in Carsavine or Valentia Island. Were it not for the government's intervention there, and were it not for the fact that the government ignored the senior civil servant at the time who said that we shouldn't do this was a total and absolute waste of money, we would be in a very different space now. But we're not, thankfully, and governments make decisions for the benefit of the people, ultimately, that elect us, and this was one of the ones that I think that we can be really, really proud of. And the rollout of it, I was in Achill recently with National Broadband Ireland, has been transformational in terms of making sure that people have access to services and opportunities that they couldn't have imagined that they would have in Achill and places like that in the recent past. So on top of that, while we've had investments, we've also had over the last number of years a lot of strategies and plans and policies and legislation. I suppose key among that, the digital strategy in 2022, which has really been one of the drivers to try and let out a series of objectives that the government, along with key partners in the commercial world, can deliver to people and to customers around the country. And that has to be hugely important. And in that space is regulatory oversight. Now, I have been quite a critic of regulatory oversight. You'll be glad to know that I'm in a good mood today. I'm not going to take the legs out from under anybody. I know there was a deep intake of breath for some people when they saw me coming today. They said, "Oh, Jesus, what's he going to say today?" I'm actually in a good mood, so you're grand. But regulatory framework is a part of this. And one of the critical things I think that has shown us in the last number of years was the recent Storm Éowyn. Like, we are a first world developed country. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the European Union, but yet an Atlantic storm can just flatten us for weeks on end. There was people down in Beara and in West Mayo that were left for, I don't know, was it 19 weeks without basic levels of communication and basic levels of connectivity. And we have to learn those lessons, and we have to make sure that they can't happen again. Because there was a time, during that whole fallout of Storm Éowyn, that they had a better telecom service in Upper Volta than we did in Limerick, and we can't be in that space again. So we need to look at resilience, and companies, and I know that the private sector through Comreg as well have done a lot of work on this over the last 6 or 8 months. And they're crossing everything, including fingers, toes, and everything else, in advance of the next storm. But the work hopefully will have made a big difference, because if a storm of that nature can literally flatten a country's telecom service and leave an area as big as Belgium and the Netherlands without a blue light service, we have a big problem, and it shows our vulnerability. And our vulnerability, in terms of our competitiveness, will obviously be one of the key factors that people looking to invest in Ireland will say, this is something that we'd be wearisome of. And I think it was a big lesson for us, and I think it was a lesson that we needed to learn, that yes, we're a wealthy country and everything was going along hunky-dory, but we also need to invest in basic infrastructure. It wasn't all the trees, contrary to what you might say, some people might have you believe. It wasn't all ash dieback that brought down the poles. In many cases it was just basic lack of preventative maintenance brought them down, and it left us in a very vulnerable state. But I think we've learned a very serious lesson. The department has, I know Comreg has too, and the companies have, to make sure that if anything of this scale is to happen again, our responses have to be totally different, because our responses the last time were wholly inadequate, both public and private, in terms of responding to people around the country. And that's something I think that is a positive since this department came into being. The next thing, I suppose, is in relation to where we stand with regard to the European Commission's State of Digital Decade Report 2025. God, that really sounds like something that I'm going to take to the bedside locker. I'm reading J.D. Vance's book at the moment. I'm kind of weighing up which am I going to lay down. Hillbilly Effigy, or the State of the Digital Decade Report 2025. It basically says that Ireland is making significant progress in it, which is an important thing to do. And some of the figures in it are quite, they're quite satisfying. Coverage of fibre and very high capacity networks has soared to over 87% in rural areas, surpassing the EU average. And as I say, when Timmy and myself were on that committee back in 2011 and 2012, we were in the halfpenny place. We weren't even in the top echelons of anything. We were the laggard of everything when it came to EU tables around network capabilities, because there was no capability. And the other thing that is worth pointing out is that rural broadband availability is at 72.19%, and 5G coverage is at 89.9%. They're all very well and good, but those percentages that are still not covered represent massive land masses, the type of landmass that I represent, very rural areas, and they're also going to have to be dealt with in the time ahead. So look, the message that I have for the conference today is one of collaboration and one of working together over the next period of time while I'm Minister for Communications, and particularly for the next 12 months in my role as President of the European Council. We have a great opportunity, I think, in terms of initiatives that will be used not only within the communication space but also within the media space. For instance, our European Digital Identity Wallet. I'm just after coming from a meeting around that with regard to how it can be used as a mechanism to protect children and vulnerable adults online, and what as a society we're prepared to say around that, and how we're to deal with people and deal with agencies and deal with governments that believe that the protection of minors online is something that should be left to parents and parents alone. Personally, I'm not happy in that space. I think that the government and governments and the European Union has a role in that, and we will be looking for collaboration with the private sector and with industry representatives to make sure that we can do more in that space. So look, the time ahead is interesting and is exciting in terms of where the government is and where policy is in this space, and particularly around making sure that the the Trojan work that we have seen over the last number of years, where we've seen phenomenal levels of growth, where we've seen phenomenal levels of employment, and we've seen Ireland way out ahead in terms of our competitiveness in the European Union, is not something that we can take for granted. They're only as fragile as the structures and the supports that are put around them. And we know that particularly with regard to climate change and everything else, we've seen the vulnerability of the infrastructure. We need to make sure that we're not in that space again, and that we're not in that space when it comes to other elements of vulnerability. So I look forward to working with the industry, and I want to thank the IIEA, Vodafone and everybody for coming today, and I look forward to the deliberations of your day. So thank you very much.
And different viewpoints in this room, so I want to have time to open it up for questions. Just for some opening comments on the discussion.
Okay, hard act to follow with the Minister. Great to be back in Dublin. I was actually trained when I moved from government service into private sector in Ireland, so it's always great to be back. And my comments will be reflective partly of Vodafone's position, but also honestly my own personal views in light of having served in government and having served and worked on how do you make sure a small EU member state, and I come from Sweden, which is a small EU member state, can remain relevant and competitive in the environment we find ourselves in. So I will make 3 points. Point number 1 is I honestly think we haven't really clocked, any of us or all of us, how serious the situation is. The Draghi report was actually issued before the latest upheavals of the geopolitical situation we find ourselves in, before the latest challenges to our export-led growth model of Europe. And what he called out, and if I had to summarize it in the most simple way possible, he basically called out that Europe has sleepwalked into a situation of self-imposed handicap and a lack of a willingness and ability to tackle its own problems. This has nothing to do with the rise of China or US trade policy or anything else. This is purely European complacency. And what he calls out is that actually is a very toxic mix for both the societies we operate in from a social point of view, where we have huge problems, including with an aging population. From a competitiveness point of view, the future of jobs, the type of prosperity that we will build for future generations, environmentally, in terms of the climate change transition that we need to do, and underpinning all of that, not to mention security, and I will come back to security later on, but underpinning all of that was the fact that we haven't taken competitiveness seriously. And no wonder there's been an element of handing that over to the private sector as it is somehow magically will fall into the laps of Europeans, and somehow we would be guaranteed by birthright to remain the most prosperous region on the planet, which is not the case. So we are at a very, very, very important moment, and I thought I'll illustrate that with digital infrastructure. Why is digital infrastructure so important for me, besides working for Vodafone, obviously, so I'm obsessed about it. It's also because if you just take a step back and look at our overall productivity numbers, and in government I work more on productivity than competitiveness. Actually, we didn't even like the word competitiveness. We looked at productivity. And we have 3 levers. We have labor, and guess what? I don't think there is a lot of politicians in Europe today that would argue for mass immigration as a way of addressing our demographic deficit or demographic challenges. You have capital utilization, which Europe actually has, broadly speaking, done really well. And then you have something called total factor productivity. And total factor productivity is the #1 driver of the gap that started to open up between us and the United States in the mid-90s and has continued ever since. So we were 10, as Europeans, we were 10% larger than the United States in 2008. We're now 23% smaller than them. And if you start asking yourself the question, why is that the case? A lot of it comes back to, besides US dynamism and the rest of it, and yes, they have more immigration, but a lot of it comes down to the question around how the US has adopted ICT as a lever of revolutionizing production methods as well as developing new products or new companies or new innovations. So what Draghi puts his finger on, and he talks a lot about the innovation, but a lot of that is driven by the ICT revolution. And the ICT revolution is dependent on digital infrastructure. For all the lovely talks about AI, and I love AI, you cannot run advanced AI on copper digital infrastructure. It just doesn't work. You cannot use the full power of cloud unless you have low latency networks. And this is the second point. So now we have established why we need to double click on digital infrastructure, hopefully. When I double click on digital infrastructure, the reason why I'm obsessed about digital infrastructure at this juncture is because of the change in technology. Everything you have known until now is mobile telephony is a people-to-people communication network. 5G standalone, as we refer to, the next generation of 5G, is the first network that is designed for machine-to-machine communication. It's actually not really done for us, because our ability to watch a cat movie on YouTube, which we do in bed before we go to bed, or in my case, I look at DIY movies, my eye will not see the difference between a high-powered 4G or a 5G DSS or low-quality 5G network versus a hyper low latency 5G standalone network. So 5G standalone, because its architecture for machine-to-machine communication, is the unleashing factor for the industrial internet. So everything that we know and how we depend on the consumer internet will happen to the manufacturing industry on the back of 5G standalone and future 6G. So just think about how our lives have changed because of the arrival of smartphone and how we use booking.com to book hotels, or how we use different travel apps, or how we manage our entire lives now on the phone. And you ask yourself, if manufacturing and farming and healthcare and the rest of it will go through the same journey on the back of industrial internet powered by 5G standalone. That's a huge transformation in the way that we run, and that will unleash then the full cloudification, sensor technology, data lakes, deploying generative AI, and more importantly, edge AI in vertical applications. And that's the key thing for Europe to lean into. So you can't run that unless you get low latency networks. So where is Europe on that? So European citizens today have access to 5G standalone at around 2% of its population. In the US, they were laggers on 5G. Trump took a decision, Rose Garden, we're going to win in 5G. He deployed the entire apparatus behind it. US went from lagger behind us to now be 24% of the population have access to 5G standalone. 24% of US companies have access to it. China, 80%. 80%. Give me one example where Europe has caught up and leapfrogged versus China in technology. Because I don't know one. We need to start planning for a scenario right now where we will be anywhere between 6 to 12 years behind China on experimenting with industrial internet applications. I don't know what type of car industry Europe will have in light of that. I don't know what will happen to our chemical industry, our pharmaceutical industry. And that's a fundamental question we have to ask ourselves. Are we prepared to be such a laggard? So Europe is in really bad state. Now, what should we do about it? My last point. So here's where I plead to Ireland. Because Ireland has a magic ingredient that many small EU member states have, which is agility. Which is knowing that your size by itself is not one where you can push your size around and sort of have a right at the table. You have to be fast and agile to gain the space. Now, that's actually a secret weapon in this environment, but it comes with a number of learnings. Number one is don't take investment for granted. You actually have to work harder than anyone else to get the investment. And frankly, in Ireland, even though the telco investors are heavily in Ireland, it is subpar for the type of 5G standalone, of which there's zero deployment currently in Ireland. So there's a big homework to be done to unleash the power of private investment into this private infrastructure. The second thing that is really, really important to do is to think about this as ecosystem. You have to understand how the network interacts with then the ecosystem of which you have sensor technology, data centers, and ultimately edge AI applications that will be invented by the many verticals. It will be invented by the farmer associations themselves, farmers themselves, the pharmaceutical companies themselves. So they are experimenting with that on the back of that infrastructure. And really unleashing that innovation. And the third one, which the minister referred to, is collaboration. And collaboration, again, small countries have many times an advantage because we can break down artificial barriers, this siloed mentality. But the fundamental question I'm calling on everyone to realize is digitization is basically the ultimate end to the way we organize our society according to the Industrial Revolution, where we thought about things like telco versus tech, or telco versus banking, or department doing X and department doing Y. Actually, digital is horizontal. And that means that you have to have horizontal strategy. You need to think end to end, including, and which is very difficult, even including for a company like us, to understand how economics relate to security. And the minister talked eloquently around resilience, which I'm very passionate about. But that actually is a lot about, are we prepared to pay for redundancy? When we talk about how we build more resilient society, there is an element of redundancy. We need to dare to ask the question, what is the investment climate for redundancy? When we have optimized capital utilization to the extent where actually there's no redundancy left. Supply chain diversification is creating redundancy. Are we prepared to pay for that? If we're not willing to pass it on to consumers, how do we absorb the cost? And it's really important questions, and small countries will be able to lead the way, including in Europe, because we're more agile and we're able to bridge those artificial silos that were created post the Industrial Revolution that doesn't work when we think about digitization.
It's a tour de force.
And I think some of this has been covered by the Minister and Joakim already, but I had 4 words for you really just to talk about where we see digital infrastructure at the moment. And each of those, I think, feeds into the competitiveness argument. The first word is reliant. The second word is resilient. The third word is robust. And the final one is radical. So I might just explain some of those words and the background to it. And I think the Minister put it very eloquently about COVID, how COVID changed from a sort of a demand point of view, what we needed and the step change that we had in our sort of digital lives, both work and at home. And what happened around the same time, and again, it was nice to hear the Minister recognising, the value that's been invested. So this whole move from copper to fibre is a multi-generational move. Ireland has gone from at the bottom of the table to beyond the average in the table. Clearly the National Broadband Plan was a part of that, but also industry's investment. It could be Cyro through Vodafone, Air, Virgin. There's been a number of commercial players also heavily investing in that move from copper to fibre. So between those two pieces, we as a society have become much more reliant on connectivity as part of our lives. Part of that connectivity, and so we had a sort of traditional telecoms, but that looks through into data centers. It's an end-to-end connectivity. And that digital infrastructure right the way through is what the customer cares about in terms of things working. A lot of that digital infrastructure is sort of US based and sort of, but if we look at the connectivity, it's sort of interesting that some of the major manufacturers, you've got Nokia, you've got Ericsson, they're actually European based. There is no equivalent in the US. The Chinese are not in that case. They are sort of self-reliant and sort of a significant player in that. I think that's worth just noting. As soon as Europe's not always behind, we're good at some things, and it's good to sort of recognize that. But that reliance is an absolutely critical thing for us to think about as a society, which brings me to the next R, which is resilience. And again, the Minister put it very eloquently about the impact of Storm Eowyn. This is a sort of a portent for us of what's coming. So we do need to be prepared. I think he was giving us too much credit about the level of preparation we've done. So I think not just for us as a regulator, but as industry, we have more work to do in this. We really have to start to think in a deep way about how do we make this system more resilient. And think about it from a consumer point of view. The consumer is much more reliant on this. Their tolerance for not having connectivity, it's totally different. It's not a nice to have, oh, sorry, I can't look at Netflix. You can't go to work. You can't talk to your children. It's an absolutely critical part of society. So the resilience piece is something we're going to have to work more on. The next word I had then was robust. And again, it's reflecting, we're in a very febrile, much less benign geopolitical world where there are players out there who want to take malicious action against our critical infrastructure. And digital infrastructure is really important here. Ireland is it's not just for the Irish consumer, the Irish end user. 30% of data in Ireland, if we believe the stats right, are for the rest of Europe. So we're a significant player at a European level. And we need to think not just about Irish citizens, but European citizens as we think of that investment in a robust system and protecting us. And we as a regulator are pulling in this. So under NIS 2, we will have new functions and new responsibilities. And that's sort of an onus for us to work with all the players in industry to make sure we can rise to the challenge. Now, you're all waiting for radical. It's not a radical regulator, I'm afraid. You'll be glad to hear. The radical in this is the technology. We're not in a sort of an incremental change. If you look at AI 3-4 years ago, LLMs, generative AI, agentic AI, this is a toddler. We haven't seen what this toddler is going to do. We need to deeply think about what the implications are of that for digital infrastructure, because it only works if you have the digital infrastructure for it. So I think we're in a very interesting space. I think regulators are conscious of that, and what we want to do is try and provide certainty, try and provide an environment that will help the investment that needs to come from capital markets, and hopefully we'll have a sort of a great sort of future coming out of this sort of engaged with this digital infrastructure.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Gareth.
Rolling the thing out a little bit further again, making more trouble for the chair. But let me do that. But let me start by going back to where I mentioned already Mario Draghi. Because Mario Draghi called out European sclerosis in very blunt terms. And in fact, we all knew about it beforehand. What was just smart was getting Mario Draghi to do the job, because he had the competence and he wasn't party pre in terms of having been around Brussels for years. So it was actually brilliant. I remember thinking, oh, that's the smart move. So he did call it out. And what's even more fantastic is he stayed with the case. And this week, he's called out where we are or aren't a year later. And I think there's a message in that for all of us. Yes, talk about what we've done, and van der Leyen reminded him of all the things that had been achieved, but there are things we haven't done. And we as a country need to do that. And we tend to be potentially very good at it, because we know to get past the frontal cortex, we've got to get people on side. So we do that very often, very generously. And then we say, however. And however is where the real magic or mischief starts. But in terms of these areas, we need to do that. And we need, it's not around the blame game. These are tricky, major strategic decisions that are interconnected. And we need to be aware of that. We need to recognize what do we need to do to be able to deliver on that. So the minister mentioned the broadband, NBI, that working. So the question is, what's the success of that? What were the success factors that made that work? What was the process within the system that actually led that? It's not perfect. There's a lot of people who be critical of the cost. But one of the things that tends to get forgotten about these public good infrastructures is that the benefits go way beyond the immediate players. So it's the real public good issue that you get spillover effects and other things that enhance productivity, enhance innovation, etc. And competitiveness is all about as I said, the weak links in the chain, making sure they're not there. So I like to think of it as being, I used to have a lovely chart at one stage, our PowerPoint slide, which had a chain, and one link was a paper clip. And that's basically what's important. And the minister touched on that very well, because of where he's been. He was aware of the further education issues in relation to a digital infrastructure, because that's crucial to have the people who have the expertise in relation to that. The other way of thinking about ourselves is, think of an orchestra. So ultimately, I'm not saying that anybody conducts competitiveness, but there has to be something where it all comes together as a collection. And that's particularly what Draghi did. He brought all those big things together. He identified the 10 key areas, and he was relentless in setting out what hadn't been done and what needed to be done. So what I like to think of is that we can have a discussion about the violins are great, and there's actually a very good leader. He's excellent. And the cellos, they're not quite as good as the violins, but they're doing well. And the leader there is actually taking on more experience, etc. But actually, if the conductor isn't there bringing it all together, it doesn't work. And I think the big issue for us as a country, the big challenge, so you talked about being nimble and agile, and I agree with you completely. The big issue is that if you are to be nimble and agile, you have to have people being able to make decisions succinctly and quickly. And there we come to the issue that, as you've pointed out, as Gareth has mentioned, this is a highly technical area where we're only in diapers or in toddlers, as you've put it, and it's going a particular direction. So where close to the decision makers do we have the knowledge base to be able to make not the perfect decision, perfection is the enemy of the good, but the best possible decision given what's there, given who we are as Ireland? Now, for anybody looking at the outside, it's always fun to read how other people describe Ireland. We look really, really good. We've got these very high-tech sectors. We've got these very high-tech activities in some of those sectors. We've made certain investments. We have more strategies to beat the band. What's missing is the connection between the strategies back to my conductor. So the violins have a great thing going, and the cellos have a great thing going, and the bassoons are doing great. But the point about it is the music has to come together to be connected. So the strategies have to be consistent. That's not trivial. That's not easy, because you're talking about quantum strategies, and you're talking about digital strategies, and you're talking about AI strategies, and they have to be brought together. You have to have people who have the intellectual wherewithal to be able to see how do we connect these together in a way we can explain to society at large what the issues and the trade-offs are here. What is the action plan over here that makes sure that we're not working against an action plan over there? There's an issue, economists, it was originally very much a Brussels idea that we should have thinking something called regulatory impact assessment. And that was the idea of ex ante, before you made some decisions, you tried to work out what would happen. Now, what really matters for those type of decisions is understanding that the people you're dealing with are strategic players. They're not just people sitting there waiting for you to do this or do that to them, or hand them this or hand them that. They're strategic. So the whole idea of regulatory impact assessment was to work out in advance, so how are they likely to do? What will they do in the short run? What will they do in the medium run? What will they do in the long run? So we had done something, I think maybe about 5 years ago on the Competitiveness Council about energy, pointing out that what we were looking for in the short run was completely inconsistent with the signals we were trying to give the industry in the medium to long run. We can't afford those, and certainly with digital we can't, because it is effectively the agricultural and the industrial revolution on speed. And it's going to have massive disruption, maybe not as much physical in terms of location of people, but it's going to, in terms of behaviours, have an absolutely huge empowering piece. So I think we should take a lesson from Mario Draghi. We should be prepared to call out what we're doing well, but what we have not yet achieved, where we're missing the power among decision makers to be able to make decisions in an effective way. Not perfection. There will always be things that won't be perfect. But we don't want, and we hear a lot of it said, particularly among civil servants over the last number of years, unexpected consequences of something. I'm fed up of hearing about unexpected consequences. That's because you didn't think through at the beginning where this was going to take you. You didn't treat the people at the other side, whether they're intermediates or whether they're putting down physical infrastructure here. We didn't think that through. And there's sort of some lessons that we can learn just by asking ourselves the hard questions. And there are no easy answers. This is not easy stuff, one way or the other. I was interested when the minister was talking about the energy crisis and Storm Owen and the learning from that. So one thing struck me. I'm on the board of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and they didn't do as badly as we did actually under Storm Owen with regard to electricity, because it turned out that they didn't let their trees be as close to their electricity wires as we did. I mean, come on, guys, that's not rocket science. So some of these things are close to rocket science, and they are really hard technically, but there are many that aren't. So I would say that the approach that the minister mentioned there, the way he articulated the interconnectivity between things, is exactly what you want to have. You want to have people not saying, this is my area, or Garrett saying, this is my area, I've nothing to do with this, this, and this. If we don't show willingness to cross-connect at some level strategically, we're not going to get to where we need to be. And your reference at the beginning to agility of small countries, we will lose that if we start saying it's what we call in Ireland a May Féin policy. It's just me, my job is fine, my regulation is fine, I'm not worried about, I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to be in front of an interview board or a public appointments committee or some other Dáil committee on something, and I'm going to make sure I've done my job properly. If we take that view to digital, in my view, we were not going to get to the agile place we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances. From my perspective, and when I was Secretary General of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, I do remember back in 22 being on a trade visit in the United States, and one of the CEOs of the biggest tech companies said to me, Orla, if I have a question on digital in Ireland, who do I ring? And it wasn't clear. So in fairness, we did come back and we worked with all of the government departments, and digital is absolutely cross-cutting. And we did produce the first digital strategy, working with departments of the Taoiseach, communications, enterprise, education, skills. And that was in 2022, and we focused on 4 aspects of it. Infrastructure was number 1, enterprise was number 2, skills was number 3, and delivery of public services through digital was number 4. And a bit like Frances said, I don't believe in strategies for the sake of having strategies. So every year we published a progress report on what was done and what was delivered. And the world has changed since 22, so it's quite interesting. Cyber wasn't as much to the forefront as it is now, obviously in national security. So there is a review going on and a major consultation. I'm sure many of you in this room were involved in that. and it closed last week. So I look forward to that updated plan and the continued implementation of it, because I think, as you said, Joakim, Garrett, Francis, this is too important for Ireland as what I would see it as a very basic, fundamental building block of our society. So, people in the room, you've all listened, you all have views. I'm going to maybe take a couple of questions together if that works for people, because I want to get everybody in who wants to speak. So let's do the usual time-honoured, raise your hand, identify yourself and the organisation that you're from, if you have one. And I'll start with gentleman here and a lady behind. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Vodafone Ireland. I work for the German embassy in Dublin. My question is relating to the tension between basically having European champions and basically internal competitiveness. Especially in the ICT sector, I think scale matters. And if you have a kind of dominant market position, actually, you basically can push everybody else out. I think we haven't really had this discussion in Europe. I mean, the US answer is quite clear, and also China, they champions, basically. But what is our position in Europe, basically, and where does Ireland fit into that?
And I will take second question here, and then I'll come back.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you very much for all the insights today and for the invitation to being here. My name is Geraldine Magner. My own company is an Indigenous tech company called Iter Analytics. But I'm here today to represent the voice as the chairwoman of the Small Firms Association. And I suppose my observation is that much of the limelight can often be bestowed upon large projects or large business enterprise when it comes to the design of policies around infrastructure and competitiveness. And I suppose, just to give you context to this, recently we did a nationwide research survey independently with Amorach, which showed, and I'm delighted to report this, that 9 out of 10 small businesses have adopted AI. Now let's also put it in context. What is a small business? Under 50 people. But here's the big figure. 98% of businesses in Ireland are small. Okay? 1% are large and circa 1% medium. But so the paper here today, it's brilliantly titled The Connectivity Dividend. And I suppose I'm here to make sure that we don't have a connectivity divide. And my question is that I often believe that some of the strategies regarding digital strategy in Ireland unintentionally can overlook the needs and the ambitions of small businesses. And clearly we have the ambition. And I was just wondering, around that, what do you think about how we can better reflect the needs of the small businesses, which cumulatively are huge? And they're not just caught in cohorts of clusters around the country. They're in far reaches, and they need rural and regional attention. And that would be my question. Thank you.
Okay, 2 questions, quite disparate, but still in that space. Who'd like to kick off?
Can do the SMEs.
You take the SMEs, Gareth?
I'll take the other one about the sovereignty,
and
scaling. Yeah.
Okay.
We've actually, Jaco and I sat on a board for a think tank in Europe, a regulatory think tank called CER, and they've just recently, in the last week, got a paper on specifically this issue about sovereignty, national champions versus competitiveness. And their clear view, and we sort of input to this paper as well, is that if we start to take this approach that we need to protect the European companies and we have to have less competition, we're damaging Europe. The best way, in the view of this paper, and I would support the view, is that opening ourselves to more competition, competing with the best. If the best are coming from the US, then that's the technology we should compete with and learn and adopt as Europeans. So the sovereignty and competitiveness, we won't achieve competitiveness if we're constantly trying to protect ourselves. So we need to push back against that sort of protectionist approach. But I'd recommend reading that paper. It articulates it much better than I can.
Sorry, I can't stop commenting on that if you allow me. I mean, I spent 20 years of my career as a northern liberal, as we call them in the EU. So that's Ireland, Sweden, Germany at times, just to be clear, the Nordic liberals. And it's a bizarre conversation going on in Brussels because it's missing the point. The point is that we don't have a functioning single market. I wish people could get serious about that. That's how you drive competitiveness. That's how you will get scale, not trying to sort of maintain our fragmentation in our own market while trying to sort of prevent competitors coming from abroad. And frankly, Europe's biggest problem besides the single market and the fragmentation, therefore preventing our own companies from scale, is that we are not paying enough attention on adoption. So, sovereignty in the absence of adopting the technologies that drive the competitiveness will be a fig leaf that in the end will crash. You do need to, and it was the Capgemini CEO earlier this week that actually went out very openly and said, and he's a French company after all, who said, I'm a big supporter of sovereignty. The way to get there is through adoption. And that's an openness approach. It's not a closure. So on SMEs, so violently agree with you. Vodafone, and I'm not coming on Ireland here. I see the local CEO sitting here and the local EAD, so I may step in it. But Vodafone in Europe, if I take that, we are not as successful as many times the incumbents or for that matter, big tech when it comes to large enterprise. We are, however, champions in most of our markets on SMEs. So we know really well the problem of SMEs. And for us, when you run, we came out with the digital gap or the actual digital divide that still permeates Europe. And our own calculations is if you will close those gaps, and that's beyond rural, urban, it's also very much between large companies and small companies, you have a potential upside of 1.3 trillion in Europe, half of which is generated from digitizing SMEs. So it's super important to be laser focused on that. Now, we also know, because we operate in many jurisdictions, the impact it has socioeconomically when you actually go through the journey of digitizing SMEs. Fantastic example of that was Spain, that we unfortunately exited, but we worked with the Spanish government to develop digitization diagnostic tool. So SMEs would be able to work with us to get a diagnostic, and we would give them then sometimes we work with US tech, sometimes we develop our products ourselves to make sure that they had a simple package, because not all of them have IT experts and the rest of it. So you need to make it very sort of plug and play. And that was a very successful program that the now EAB chair or managing director, Nadia Calvino, was working with Vodafone to create. In Portugal, where we are focused a lot on SME digitization, the companies that were successfully digitizing SMEs pay 37% higher salaries for their workers. So it has a direct impact on the socioeconomic fabric of society. So I'm a big supporter of it. We don't talk about it enough. Frankly, many times as a Vodafone, I find myself, for example, in the European Parliament, talking about, I want to deploy 5G network. I don't really need to do it for the next GlaxoSmithKline factory. They are rich enough to pay for a mobile private network. The reason why I need a public 5G standalone network is because it's the only method for me to bring 5G standalone to SMEs. Because all the large factories will be able to pay for mobile private networks. None of the SMEs will be able to pay for a mobile private network. It's simply too expensive. And in Germany, a month ago, we launched actually a 5G slice, because there we have 5G standalone, because we're really, really pushed ahead with the support of the government, targeted for SMEs.
I think what really points to is the fact that in policy terms, we need to make sure that what we're delivering works for SMEs. And that's around how we do it. And I know the department you were in, Orla, has been developing that over the years. But actually, it's changing all of the time, as with technology, because there are different ways of accessing these. And the idea of giving people maximum choices doesn't make any sense, because you put on the burden of choice onto them, which has been one of the things I think people have done incorrectly. Likewise, R&D supports in terms of tax allowances here are very much centred on the Frascati manual, which is very much biased towards the very big firms who can do the R&D. The smaller firms don't benefit from that as much as they would do from the Oslo manual. And we've embedded that into our system, which basically works against the SMEs compared with the larger companies.
Let me take another couple of questions. So gentleman here, Dan here, and somebody at the back. So that's three. Let's take those three, if I may.
Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Ciara Meskel. I'm from 3 Ireland. You've outlined some opportunities and challenges for digital infrastructure and competitiveness. What is the one policy change each of you would take if you could? To deliver the digital infrastructure that feeds into competitiveness, what is the one policy change that each of you individually would take if you could?
Thanks for that, Karen. Gentleman down the back.
Sorry, Gary McDonough from IBEG. Congratulations, Vodafone, and to the whole panel. Discussion. I was struck by Francis's comment, actually, a number of people about the need for collaboration, coherence. It's put as a kind of an orchestra, is the idea. So I suppose the question is connectivity across the regulators. How could we achieve that? I mean, I think there are moves on that, but just maybe your thoughts on that, Gareth, would be great, because we have a lot of different regulators now in this space. And so how do we make sure we're all driving in the same direction is the question I'd have.
Chief Economist here at the Institute. Thanks to all the panelists and the chair. The Mario Draghi report year out has been mentioned a lot of good stuff in it, a lot of urgency. But the one area that struck me in it was his advocacy of replicating US for broadband. Now, what's the best indication of competitiveness in a market? Prices. So prices for broadband in Europe are lower than they are in the United States. So I couldn't quite understand why he was advocating moving towards the European model when European prices are lower. So just interested to get the panel's views on that, on the levels of competitiveness in that segment of the market, at least in Europe, and are we actually doing better than the US? And we don't want to go down their route, which may be excessively oligopolized, as we say.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm conscious we're slightly over time, folks. I'm going to run it a little bit, just to, obviously to let the panelists answer, but we did start a little late as well. So hopefully many of you you're still with us. So we'll take these three, and then we might move to wrap up.
Okay, the one policy change, and in the EU I would have to say three. So in Ireland I'll say one, because you asked about Ireland. For me, the lifeblood of our industry, digital infrastructure, is spectrum. Move to forever perpetual licenses, which, by the way, is one of the things the US does. Move away from auctions, prolong the spectrum that is already in the books, and instead force the industry to contractually commit to invest the money that's saved by not paying for the spectrum. So put the money to use for the benefit of citizens and businesses as opposed to going to the fiscus. That's the one thing which would make a huge difference and benefit everyone and accelerate the rollout. On the example of or the orchestration, I think personally South Korea did a fantastic job because they are closer to China, so they probably paid more attention to how China took off than we in Europe did. So South Korea, at prime minister's level, this is never treated in South Korea. Digital or connectivity is not a departmental issue, it's a prime minister issue. And so therefore the prime minister established the South Korean strategy for 5G standalone leadership and has orchestrated that across all relevant departments. And that includes, for example, public services and how to digitize that, utilizing the data also from the public services for public good and the rest of it, including rapid acceleration of 5G standalone. In terms of Draghi, and that's a really good question, I could spend forever talking about it. To simplify it down, Europe has taken something as complex and as important, and it is the number one measure of success in my view, which is consumer welfare, which is not prices. Because consumer welfare includes the question around quality. And one of my concerns is, if you take, for example, a country that runs super low prices, but in the process of doing so have killed the investment cycle that is underpinning this industry, will end up, everyone has low prices for 3G. Why is that great if everyone else has moved to 6G? So if you have already a proof point of Europe's prices, and by the way, I'm not advocating higher prices, I'm advocating that we need to solve this investment conundrum through other means, but Europe has put itself that it moved from a leader in rolling out mobile technology to a laggard. The best performing capital 2 years ago in Europe was Helsinki on 5G. It was worse than Bangkok. I mean, I'm not even bringing in the US. My home country, Sweden, at that time was worse than Guatemala. UK was behind Costa Rica. I mean, we're not competing here with the world champions of competitiveness. Huh? So I think there is a wake-up call. And yes, it's true. Prices are super important. Why? Because it drives affordability, which drives adoption, which is great. But you have to make sure that it doesn't break the investment cycle, because it's the investment cycle that drives long-term price deflation in this industry. We throw more capacity every time we upgrade our network. And that then creates a virtuous cycle of investment and price deflation.
Thank you for that. Joakim? Garrett?
So I might answer Eric's question first, because it sort of goes into my policy ask, I suppose, as well, which is we have identified that as an issue of how do we work as regulators. So we have a group of 4 regulators on the digital side, so ourselves, CCPC, Commission Oman, and DPC. We meet on a regular basis, and I want to call this out at government level. We also have a senior officials group, and we will meet with them on a regular basis. We'll have our next meeting next week. We sit down, we talk about the various things that are coming in from Europe. There's a large range of new digital files that are arriving on our desks, sort of collectively. And that sort of feeds into my ask. It would be nice at a European level to have a little bit more cohesion around all these digital files. Just feels there's been an awful lot of them. And if they could just be more cohesive together, I think that would help a lot at a European level. In terms of the competitiveness, now, Joakim, you and I probably don't agree on this, and that's okay. Regulators don't have to agree with it. So we and my fellow commissioner, Robert, is actually chairing the European telco regulators at the moment, and they've done quite a bit of work looking at the US markets. But I tend to agree with you that the prices are certainly cheaper at a European level, but I'm not sure that the infrastructure is better. You have to be very careful comparing geographies are quite different. But connectivity in the US is, I don't know if you've been there recently, but you get a train in the US, once you move out of the city, boom, and the Wi-Fi on the train is terrible. And, it's not got the connectivity that we've started to just take it for granted in Ireland. So, I do think that it's really important that we have that investment. On the spectrum side, we have a different view on spectrum. We think, we have 20-year licenses. I think it's really important that the people are not investing in a government of the day. They're investing in a system. They're investing in good regulation. They're investing in certainty. And that's something that Europe has, arguably, as an advantage at the moment with the US. There's some changes going on in that certainty that's undoing and will have long-term consequences. But for spectrum, so we have licenses for 20 years, but we think we don't know what's going to happen in 20 years' time, so it's better to have that. It's a state resource. We manage that resource on behalf of the state. We say we don't do it to maximize revenue. We do it in a way that tries to we say that an auction is a good way of allocating a scarce resource. But we do that on a sort of every so often on the basis that we don't know what the needs will be in the future, and we think that's the best way of assessing that. I'm sure we'll have fundamental disagreements on that, but that's the rationale for why we do it the way we do it. Yeah.
Francis, final word to yourself.
Very quickly, just in relation to the South Korean example, I mean, things when they are important in Ireland, usually they require crisis to use the word, and we're slow to use it, but we sometimes should do it more often. Taoiseach's department leads, and that's the Prime Minister's department, and that's been very successful in a lot of major changes, particularly where there are parties spread across not just the civil service departments, but the agencies who are also very powerful, are indeed the regulators. So the issue about spectrum licensing is kind of outside my pay grade, but the bit I know about this that I understand is this is very complicated, and the design of the mechanisms really, really matters. Why do we have Nobel Prize winners in the last two groups of Nobel Prize winners getting for this particular area? Why? Because it's really important. Why are they directly involved in advising American companies and government how to do this? So that's really important. I don't know to what extent we have that expertise here and how we're using it and how it's seen, but what we do know is that how you do these things really matter for the long term. And weaknesses in design can either be underinvestment or can end up being to lower prices but uneven. And finally, Gareth, I have to say, as the regular, probably the most regular user in this room, maybe not, I shouldn't be guessing, of the Dublin to Belfast train, to use a train to measure something of connectivity in America is, to be honest with you, hilarious. But even in this country, it's not very good. So I wouldn't be going that particular way. If you want to criticize American coverage, I would suggest you try to find something else rather than the train system. It may well be weak, but the train system isn't the way to judge it.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you all for being here. I did say earlier that the strategy has just closed its consultation. I did touched base with them this morning and said, if there's anything wonderful, please let us have it. So I will reflect back some of the comments here. It is being run from the Prime Minister's office. So again, as I said, both in terms of regulators, agencies and government departments, and obviously all the industry, because I do think one thing Ireland does do very well is talking to right across the board, industry, private sector, SMEs. One of the things we did do, and I think going back to your question, Geraldine, just on the SMEs, we really did make a huge step up during COVID in terms of supporting the SME sector in digital. And it's interesting because my colleagues in New Zealand said to me they had actually lost years because they closed their borders during COVID, whereas we actually ramped up hugely small businesses to cope with the difficulties. We could be here for the whole afternoon. I find it fascinating. I'm quite sure all of you in the room do as well. But unfortunately, some of you have a day job to get back to. I look forward to this discussion continuing. Can I particularly thank our three speakers today, Joakim, Garrett and Francis. Can I thank the IEA team and Vodafone team who set this up. Particular thanks to Seamus, who I think in the IEA, who really got the agenda going and got us all in place and facilitated the discussion. Safe home, everybody, and thank you very much for your presence today.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.